I was always very excited about the possibilities that new technologies brought. I was curious about innovation. But gradually, I kept seeing a bigger and bigger gap between this promise of technology being emancipating, uplifting the voices of the unheard. A wave of democracy would spread the earth if people just had access to their phones and social media. And the more I saw with my own eyes, the real struggles that democracy activists were waging across the world, the more I felt like these promises rang hollow. And if we didn't govern for better democratic outcomes, more protections of human rights in the digital realm, then we wouldn't achieve those goals.
Yeah.
And so here we are. I think a tech coup is happening in front of our eyes.
All right, so let me introduce you properly. Today I'm talking to Marietje Schaake, and she is an author and a professor. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And Marietje is a non-resident fellow at Stanford Cyber Policy Center and the Institute for Human-Centered AI. She is a columnist for the Financial Times and serves on a number of not-for-profit boards, as well as the UN's high-level advisory body on AI. Between 2009 and 2019, she served as a member of the European Parliament, where she worked on trade, foreign, and tech policy. She is the author of the Tech Coup that we will be talking about today and that I finished reading 2 days ago, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. And she is in conversation with me. And I would ask you to please subscribe right now on YouTube. You're watching it live here and or later as a recording with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts later, and to my Substack commentary, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And I just want to add, Marietje, that we are going to make this book part of our book club. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read.
Oh,
and
great.
by the end of this show, Ernie will tell me, he will text me and tell me what month this will be in our book club. It'll be soon. And we will re-promote it, and I will be doing videos that I place on shorter formats that will talk about the fact that what I'm about to tell you now. And that is that, if I was going to read a book in the time frame in which Donald Trump was elected and we see Elon Musk standing next to him and all these tech bros arm in arm inside our Capitol.
Right.
And you have written a book, literally on them. You've written a book explaining how they threaten our democracy and why. And it's not some paranoid, delusional fantasy about they're rich and they're awful and they threaten our democracy. It's a very detailed account of how tech can both be useful, because you're not anti-tech, but at the same time does more than just threaten democracy by helping Donald Trump establish a U.S. monarchy, which is a different subject, but is also happening with courtiers and all the rest following him, of which these tech pros have become those people. But you go into details of how tech's very existence changes the game in a way that I've never read anywhere. So the first thing I want to say is this will not be an objective podcast. I am a huge fan of yours. I love the writing. You're the rare academic that can actually communicate, because I'm a writer and usually academics can't, but you're a really good writer. And the book is wonderful. And it's so timely that it gives me kind of goosebumps. It's just crazy to read a book on how high tech is changing the rules of democracies, both in the United States and Europe and globally, by someone who's on the inside of the system, because this is what you do for a living. And you have consulted and been an advisor to the European Parliament on this and other things. Bills have been written that you've had a big influence on in terms of some regulation. So I don't really know where to start other than just tell people that if there's a book that I've read in the last 10 years, I'll go that far, that I would put as number one must read, this is it. So I'm going to just start by just reading something actually from the I think it was the Washington Post, which sort of sets up your book, even though your book took place before the election. What happened on Monday at the Capitol was the inauguration of the oligarchs. This was an inauguration of the oligarchs, the billionaires, the ball come to Washington. Donald Trump did everything but invite the tech moguls to join him in taking the oath. And I just thought that was so well put. So now I want to jump into your book. I think actually I'm doing it backwards because this is from page 247 of the American edition, which I'll get you to hold up in just a moment because I read it on Kindle and I want people to memorize the cover and strip the shelves of every bookstore you know of her book and give them away to people and read them. And I'm going to put it in my book club, and you all put it in your book clubs, please, if you want to actually do something useful this year. And here's what you write. Our ability to solve problems for the public good is significantly diminished when insights remain locked inside corporate environments. We live in an age of information overload and knowledge deficit. And then at another place, and this is from page 17 earlier, that I'm running together to show people the scope of your book. This is not a book against technology, but in favor of democracy. It is a call to rebalance technology's role in democratic societies to ensure better protection of democratic values. And then from another place in your book, the unaccountable power of technology companies and the threat they pose to democracy are by now familiar refrains. The newspapers are littered daily with scandals that cover the latest revelation of problems at one or another social media platform, search engine, or retail platform. The purpose of this book is not to preach to the choir and to rehash those stories, however significant and urgent they may be. Instead, this book begins from the premise that these incidents point to systemic problems that need unpacking. The fact that our social, professional, and civil lives are increasingly digitized, and essentially all aspects of digitization are in the hands of private companies. That certain technologies have inherently anti-democratic characteristics, while laws to protect democratic values and the rule of law are lagging. And then from another place, corporate leaders and aspiring autocrats alike take advantage of this situational blindness and push the boundaries of the law. And from another place, in 2019, after serving more than a decade in the European Parliament, I, that's you, Marietje speaking, stepped down from politics and moved to the belly of the beast, Silicon Valley and Stanford University. I wanted to help bridge the gaps between the worlds of politics and policy. Okay, so that's how I want to set up your incredible book. Now hold it up, show everybody the cover, which I would be doing here if I hadn't read it on Kindle. And here it is, the Tech Coup, How to Save, and just read the subtitle if you will.
How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley.
Yes, and this is Marietje Schaake, and she is a phenomenon. And I think I read an article, was it in the New York Times or the Washington Post? How did I first run into you? Where was the article I read by you? It was maybe an excerpt from...
by me? Financial Times? You see?
That's
because
right.
I'm a columnist there. Yeah.
That's it. I read something and then it was like, oh, I have to find out. And then I went and bought your book. Then I read it and now we're talking. So that's a much longer introduction than I usually give, but this is a much more important book. We're going to make it part of the book club. And one last thing, when will it be on? Ernie, my producers, just told me it will be, and it has to be read offering in March.
Great. Well, thank you for those warm words. What can I say? It's humbling, but I'm excited to dive into the conversation.
Well, me too. And you're sitting in Holland and I'm in Massachusetts, and here we go. So let's start by how you came to write this book in terms of what brought you to the subject. Okay, you're in tech, you earn your living with it. When did you begin to worry about democracy and our democratic values and the participation of people through their governments rather than through an oligarchical structure that is being imposed on us by the tech bros, as they are usually known? So just where do we begin? Where did you begin with this journey?
Well, maybe we'll begin when I started serving in the European Parliament. I mean, I've always been curious about technology. I've never worked for companies. I've always worked for sort of public interest objectives. And in fact, I was always very excited about the possibilities that new technologies brought. I was curious about innovation. But gradually, between the popular uprisings in the Middle East and the massively rapidly growing tech companies that privatized so much of the internet in the way we used it, that were all focused on profit maximization, I kept seeing a bigger and bigger gap between this promise of technology being emancipating, uplifting the voices of the unheard. A wave of democracy would spread the earth if people just had access to their phones and social media. And the more I saw with my own eyes, the real struggles that democracy activists were waging across the world, the more I felt like these promises rang hollow. And if we didn't govern for better democratic outcomes, more protections of human rights in the digital realm, then we wouldn't achieve those goals. And at the same time, saw a huge push for, the uptake of new technologies, digitization, while governments were really leaving way too much room to market players.
Yeah.
And so here we are, I think a tech coup is happening in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
We are closer to real threats to democracy than I feared, even though I was, very alarmed when I wrote the book. I wanted to show that this is a systemic, serious threat to democracy, but I was also really, quite upbeat about what we could still do to turn the tide. And without the United States on board, because, we have to just write off the United States for the next 4 years with this marriage between Silicon Valley and the White House in the most perverse ways, I have to say. This is going to be a lonely fight for the others who want to protect civil liberties, who want to make sure that AI doesn't, threaten national security or violate non-discrimination principles, for people who believe that antitrust rules are a core pillar of our open economies. Rules are there for reasons, and I don't think we will see much protection or movements towards more resilient democracies from Washington. I say with a heavy heart.
Yeah. And, it seems to me they have such a bad track record in what you might call such lesser fields of importance. For instance, how the tech bros have dealt with the needs of just parents trying to figure out what to do with children staring at their phones. They've been so unsympathetic and refused even the most basic common sense regulation. That doesn't bode well, does it?
No, it doesn't. And, the significant turns that the Zuckerbergs and the Bezoses and the Brad Smiths of this world have been taking, initially sort of leaning into taking greater responsibility for content on their platforms, for example, for preventing harms, but now really, pretending that was always censorship and that it was a mistake to take some ownership of preventing, for example, disinformation on health during the COVID pandemic.
Sure.
It turns out that it was opportunistic all along, that this was not some sort of evolution or progress in their own acknowledgement of their power, which, it could be perceived as, but much more a bending with the winds of power, very opportunistic and cynical, very cynical, because the way in which these tech CEOs have crawled onto the lap of Donald Trump, I think, is just, it's ugly.
Yeah, it's symptomatic of the whole problem. And the thing is that I think where we've underestimated it, we've talked a lot about greed, overwhelming original passion for ideals. Google, will do no harm. All of a sudden, that's gone and we're in another place. And one passage you have in your book here, I just want to read out loud. Many modern corporate tech leaders believe deeply that they can serve their users better than governments can serve their citizens. Emboldened tech billionaires in the grips of this belief brazenly articulate the outside role they can and believe they should play in shaping society and building companies that skirt existing regulation while seeking to replace government capabilities. They have kept the pioneers' romantic vision of a decentralized society, while anti-government attitudes now serve corporate power more than any other ideals. Peter Thiel, co-founder of PayPal, is perhaps the most outspoken of these billionaires. Okay, that's where we were when you wrote this book minutes ago. And where we are now is they've taken the next step. They are not saying we are outsiders. They're saying, no problem with our guy in the White House. We don't have to have this alternative to government. We are the government, and we are not going to be regulated, and we'll do what we damn well want, whether it's in our space programs because we all grew up watching science fiction, or whether it's through AI. So they've sort of jumped into the next phase of this in an unimaginable way that nobody could have pictured. And that is a complete symbiotic relationship between not government, but the Donald Trump aspect, him presenting himself sort of as a monarch, right out of Elizabethan England, and they're presenting themselves as competing courtiers in a monarchical setup, which is itself jumping the boundaries of democracy. So I wouldn't even know where to start on that. But how do you see where we are this minute talking together in January of 2025?
Well, look, let's see
if you wrote a postscript to the book now.
Yeah, I'm about to for the paperback version of the US version. So it's
we'll re-promote it.
Yes, so it's I think where they find each other is in this notion that all the institutions, all the boundaries and the state roles that we've known can be challenged, must be challenged, and might as well be disrupted or broken. Mm-hmm. That the alternative that they themselves can bring through technology or through, an anti-statist kind of view, and not to forget the big influence of crypto investors and believers in the Trump administration as well. Sure. It's not just the established companies, but also the crypto bros.
Well, not only is it unregulated, it's untraceable.
Exactly, but and it's been a tool for grift, as evidenced by this new meme that also the president put out days before his inauguration.
Yeah.
So there is little, if any, respect for the pillars that hold up the rule of law and that a democratic society can operate within.
Yeah.
And while I appreciate both the criticism of the status quo and the excitement about innovating also democracy, improving it, and challenging our conventional wisdom, I get all of that, and I don't think we should shy away from it. But that is something else than coming in as a bulldozer, self-confident, and showing absolutely no regard for why some of these principles are enshrined in law.
Yeah.
Why governments need to balance different interests.
Yeah.
While there's a trade-off between different priorities, that it is not easy, that there are, real threats to the homeland or to the environment or to minorities. And it feels like for both the CEOs and President Trump and his, following, apparently, the Republican Party as it is today, this kind of, bulldozing it is fair game. Yeah. And I think it's a very dangerous game, not only for Americans, obviously, especially the most vulnerable. It's so easy to go after queer kids. It's really heartbreaking. It's so easy to go after immigrants that on the one hand hold up the American economy and on the other hand are, of course, incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah.
They can't defend themselves because they would out themselves and that would make them a target, and Donald Trump, I'm sure, has employed illegal immigrants. Like I'm 100% sure of it.
Well, I employed one today because I bought berries in my supermarket that were picked somewhere.
Exactly.
That's my breakfast tomorrow.
Yes. And so I think it is just cynical. I'm going to use the word again, but I also mean in a sort of cheap politics way.
Sure.
But this is all happening at a moment where democracy worldwide is already under a lot of attack and threat.
Yeah.
The rules-based order is under threat, and America is now presenting itself as a non-reliable actor because it's withdrawing from the Paris Environment or Climate Agreement. It's withdrawing from the World Health Organization. It is putting up for discussion membership of NATO, the World Trade Organization. It is, punching former allies in the face, and coming up with all kinds of outrageous trade measures. So I worry that this whole attitude of disruption is an opportunity.
Yeah.
has been taken too far, because there are certain things that should not be disrupted.
Yeah.
And we will now see how resilient the system will be. But if you look at how many people have already sort of gladly stepped in line with
Well, you when you talk
Trumpian
about
republicanism.
yeah, when you talk about things that shouldn't be disrupted, it goes past this because when you think of what Kennedy is saying about vaccines, I had polio when I was 2. I have a leg that's like a toothpick and a foot that looks like a claw because my parents were late in giving me a polio vaccine. These are not joking matters. This is
No.
where we all live. And if you start actually undermining the credibility of a very basic healthcare system, we're now not talking about politics anymore. We are talking literally about life and death issues.
Yep, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm really sorry that that's what happened to you, because I'm sure this makes that discussion all the more personal as well. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
and it's not just about headlines and programs and impacts down the road. This is real, and you're right. And it's gonna harm children that have absolutely no agency
Yeah,
in
yeah.
pushing back against these choices, in their parents believing that there are better ways to go. And um,
Well, and during the COVID vaccine brouhaha, the media was full of stories, real stories, and people went online with real stories about a father or an uncle who had died from COVID, having refused the vaccine, and literally on his or her deathbed was muttering to their relatives, "I'm so sorry I didn't get the shot."
Yeah, we had similar cases here in the Netherlands as well, but I think by and large the world doesn't look to the U.S. healthcare system as being very advanced,
No.
and even those basic provisions will now be challenged, and so
Yeah,
it's going
exactly.
to have victims. The same with the freedom to have an abortion if need be.
Yeah.
Women will suffer, and it is just, again, going after the most vulnerable, and it will have real life harms. But until then, we will hear amazing stories about, billion-dollar investments in the economy and growth, and a slamming of the previous administration, as has just happened in Davos, where Trump gave a speech remotely. Um, we have to brace ourselves
Yeah, it'll
in
be
the
the thing.
broadest sense of the word, but I've just looked at the outsized power, the unaccountable power of tech leaders,
Yeah.
and it's only a slice of the problem, but it fits in this broader
But it's a
context.
huge slice because it provides not only the motivation for deregulation, which they will provide of their own industries, but it sets in motion a deregulatory pattern which will affect everything. Because
Mhm.
this is the new thing. This segues to something I want to read from your book. You say those who praise the democratizing possibilities of technology and social media platforms failed to appreciate that repressive authoritarian regimes could be tech savvy too. And again, that's sort of a weird bridge because in the context of your book, you're sort of setting up what you'll be talking about the Arab Spring and the way Facebook and other people became a vehicle for hate messages, that it wound up with people being killed literally by the thousands in Myanmar and all sorts of places. Some you talk about, some you don't. But actually, just thinking about that again, failed to appreciate that repressive authoritarian regimes could be tech savvy too. But of course, Donald Trump's regime has started as a repressive authoritarian regime. So this is not a surprise, in addition to which the people who are tech savvy are his biggest fans.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we in Europe are actually dismayed at the fact that Elon Musk, who must have support from Donald Trump in doing this, is supporting far right parties, all over the continent. In the
Yeah,
UK, he's
yeah,
stirring unrest by making unverified claims about, violence and what have you. In Germany, he supports the Alternative for Deutschland, a far-right party, lent his platform and his 210 million followers to the
yeah.
leader of the far-right. And, I listened into that interview, was actually really a sort of a pathetic, in terms of, very few political points, lots of giggling. It was almost like a first date that we were all listening into. So, in fact, she didn't really use the moment for a big political vision that convinced many people. I think, but the idea that a businessman with multiple key interests of geostrategic nature, when we look at Starlink and Tesla, of political nature, when we look at X, can have such a role in pushing for leaders in different countries while being the key advisor to the US president is
Yes.
just, it's too much of a conflict of interests.
Yeah.
And I think the narrative of helping the ordinary American lead a better life, which I think they all deserve, doesn't add up when you look to the interests that are really served, those of billionaires.
Well, we got a hint of that with his tax cuts in his first term.
Right.
And that's nothing compared to what's going to happen now, because the people who will most benefit from him aren't just looking for more money by paying less taxes. They're looking for a deregulated system of their own industries in a way that takes them out of the political mix altogether. The SEC can't look at them anymore. They can't be arrested for anything. We now know that political violence can be, if it's done on behalf of Trump, they'll be pardoned.
Yep.
You can beat it.
Militias have been let off the hook, which is
you can be in a militia and you can shoot a cop now. You can become a cop killer. And traditionally, that's where a line was crossed. Not anymore. We have people who tried to beat police officers to death on the steps of our Capitol, and they're out of prison now. So basically, it's a weird message, because it's not only the deregulation of the billionaire class in a way they could never have dreamt could happen. You're no longer subject to any laws. It's also the decriminalization of political violence, as long as it's on behalf of one side. And this is a first in American history. Usually we have people who sort of paid lip service to the rule of law and then winked at, say, a police riot in Chicago at the '68 convention, but it wasn't formal. Now that is formalized. So we're kind of in a new place. And I want to read something from your book and just open up another piece of the discussion here, and then talk about what I just talked about here. The privatized governance of disruptive digital infrastructure, products, and services erodes our rights and freedoms as citizens. Monetary policy is hobbled by Bitcoin. The presumption of innocence erodes when products like Clearview AI identifies people as suspects. And oversight over government tasks is blurred when Palantir analyzes data. So this is sort of another side of it. But when you then take that to the next step and put all that in service of one political party and one person who dominates that party, with followers who literally apparently will believe anything, one thing they will believe is that rape doesn't matter anymore, whether it's the credible accusations of rape against Donald Trump or people he nominates for various high roles in our government who have been accused of similar crimes. The mind boggles. I don't know how to put it all together, but I'd like you to somehow draw some inferences with your argument in your book about how this impacts us, especially and in a way that multiplies in toxicity through tech. Because I don't think without tech involved in this, it would not be as damning. With tech involved, it almost seems like a slam dunk. It almost seems unanswerable, because take me, I'm a podcast. What tools do I have left to answer the decriminalization of political violence combined with tech's ability to basically take my platform, which is you and me talking today, and do whatever they want with it?
Or make sure that nobody sees you anymore.
Or make sure nobody sees me, which, by the way, Facebook's algorithms already do, because my stuff used to be on Facebook in a way that was easily monetized. And then all of a sudden they rewrote the algorithm. And if you don't pay and help them, promote something, the rules change overnight. So I went from some videos on Facebook with 200,000 or 300,000 views, literally, down to a couple of thousand views is a good day now. And then all of a sudden, YouTube's the only place that I can get those couple 100,000 views again, because their algorithm's a little different, and it could change tomorrow. And I don't have any, in the old days as an author, I could do bookstore signings and I could speak at colleges and have some impact on my footprint. And now these things are totally outside of my control, held by a few people, and it's become politicized. It's a very odd position.
Yeah, and so that's a personal story that shows the power of that lever, right? That button that they can just turn a bit and it changes the whole outcome.
Yeah,
But we are subject to that kind of tweaking and even experimenting in real life as a society.
yeah,
And as disenfranchised as you are vis-a-vis these big companies to call someone or say, hey,
right.
how can I better position my podcast or my platform or my
Yeah,
business? For a lot of people, these are also places where they do business. People don't have a sense of why they are seeing what they're seeing. And it turns out that if you just look at X and how it has changed since Elon Musk has
sure.
ownership over it, some of it is explicit, like he thinks trust and safety teams that look after the worst kinds of expression and worst kind of risks on social media platforms are redundant. He has fired them. This power has always been significant in the hands of these tech leaders.
Yeah.
Elon Musk makes it explicit. I think that's the one thing that is helpful in this discussion is that this power is now much more explicit, and
Yeah.
the notion that it's not just what someone says or the campaign donations that they make, but also the algorithm, i.e., the business model and the discretionary choices
Yeah.
that business leaders can make about our information diet collectively. The impact of, for example, demoting posts with links to news media
Yeah.
is huge, because actually if you want to have a discussion about societal issues and you want to link to a source,
Yeah.
that is I think a more substantiated argument than if you just throw a claim out there without a source.
Yeah.
But those unfounded claims are now ranked higher by Musk, and besides the little things that we do know, we don't have sufficient transparency into how these proprietary models work.
Well, and when
Not
you
for
own the system,
Facebook.
basically it's like an author owning the bookstore, the publisher, and the reviewers. So all of a sudden, the only book you find in your bookstore is by Elon Musk. And it's promoted. It's face out on 100 shelves, and yours is buried somewhere down at the bottom of the paperback section. If that happened in that old world, there would be a scandal. But now, at the flip of a switch or the change of an algorithm, we can make your book disappear.
Well, and if you look for a book on measles or something like that, you will be recommended a book that says measles are great.
Yeah,
Enjoy. And
yeah,
so it
exactly.
also leads to like perverse incentives and rewards for disinformation, people who can game the system. We've seen that with foreign interference from Russia, for example.
Yeah,
Yes, so it's that leadership in service of shareholders is something with completely different objectives
yeah,
and goals than what a democracy needs. Yet
yeah.
we've outsourced significant parts of our democracy, namely our information curation, to for-profit entities.
Well,
And
and more
so,
than that, for entities now that are using the government, which they've captured through Elon Musk's efforts and the effect it had on Donald Trump in the actual election. A lot of people credibly say that Elon Musk helped swing it in his favor, that if you took him putting his thumb on the scales out of the picture, Trump might well not have had a second term. But, I think the point you make in your book that is phenomenal is so far beyond greed. It's into power, but it's power via deregulation. It's power by undoing what government does. Let me reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Marietje Schaake. And we are talking about her book. She does all sorts of things at Stanford and the European Parliament and all the rest, but I just want to get back to our discussion and say that you are the author of a book that I want you to hold up again now, because I'm not able to show it because I read it on, and would you please say the title and the subtitle?
the Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. And it's actually also an audiobook if people prefer.
Yes, and I did it on Kindle, so I know it's there, and I clipped a lot of good comments out of it that I'm using here, and Kindle's very useful for that. So I just want to get back into the book here. The privatized governance of disruptive digital infrastructure, products and services erodes our rights and freedoms as citizens. Take that sentence And of course, there's a lot in your book about that. And, that's from page 112. But I want you to just unpack that one sentence. Talk about that for as long as you want, because that's so much the heart of your book.
So basically, the decision-making power of tech companies really impacts our own agency. So if you just look at AI, a big theme now because it's, so hyped and so new, we don't know exactly why models in the realm of AI do what they do.
Yeah.
Yet they are being pushed out onto the market. In fact, when OpenAI put out ChatGPT, Google had similar model it was working on, but it wouldn't release it into the public because the company itself saw too many risks. But then when one player, OpenAI, began to make public their models, Google felt, or DeepMind felt, that they had to rush ahead as well. And so we see that the incentives, the tolerance for risk, and the concern for the consequences is all in favor of the tech companies because they can just experiment with us in real time.
And that, by the way, and I said I wouldn't interrupt, but your book is so strong on this. This was before they became Donald Trump's court. So, in other words, it's such a huge point because that's all of what you're saying is true before they have been put in a position where they can no longer be regulated.
Well, there is enormous governance power in the hands of tech executives, their platforms, big and small, I should say, in a couple of ways. Through the technology that they're developing that just creates new realities, through the market cap that they have that is extraordinary. So if you just take the market cap of a company like Microsoft, and you plot it against the GDP of countries and you would rank them, Microsoft would rank between the 7th and 8th largest economy, between the economies of the entire countries of France and Italy. If we take the 10 largest tech companies from the US, compares to the GDP of the EU or China. These are enormously well-resourced companies, of course, as a result of our dependence on them. But that money buys a whole bunch of things. I mean, good old lobbying, but also talent hiring, also representation in all kinds of international fora, data, compute, the ability to have a pole position for the next wave of technologies. And if you look at the sum of those ways of having influence, then you can just see how there is growing friction between what is good for the companies and what they're capable of doing, and how it becomes a sort of accelerator of power, facilitates more power. That is at odds with what the public interest might require. For example, the public doesn't have the kind of access to information to understand a number of details about artificial intelligence, for example. There are no significant or sufficient, I should say, there are not the sufficient checks and balances that we would need to sort of offset that growing power. And because we don't have that access to information, it's hard to have a fact-based public debate, a public debate that, as we discussed, is also influenced by profit objectives through the algorithms. Then they have the resources to support certain candidates, as we're seeing now also with Elon Musk, basically funding against critical members of Congress, for example. And so you can
European parliaments. He's interfering in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, no, European political leaders as well. It is, you can see how this becomes a flying wheel of corporate power, tech power vis-a-vis democracy and the rule of law. And I think that is incredibly risky and dangerous for us as citizens, for the public interest writ large. And just for the idea that there should be, a public mandate and public accountability to our leaders, that we shouldn't just have, random people in such positions of power overtaking the role that states used to play in a number of areas. Look at cyber conflict, look at critical infrastructure, look at intelligence gathering, for example. And so I do think we will see more confrontation. I mean, in the domains of people who are responsible for national security, this cannot sit well. We've already seen deep concern for a long time in civil liberties circles, people who appreciate how the right to privacy, non-discrimination,
Yes.
self-determination are under enormous pressure, the rights of women, the queer community. So it is a systems problem. That is what I've wanted to show. So I think it's important for listeners as well to appreciate this as a phenomenon that is much bigger than Elon Musk,
Yes.
and that is not just a responsibility or the blame or the result of actions by companies, but it's also because Democrats and Republicans, governments, upon governments for decades, have decided to give these companies enormous power.
Yeah, well, for
And so
instance, in the States, they didn't count them as media, and so they had none of the regulations or the checks and balances that
right.
old school media had. They were, in other words, they were not responsible for anything they published or the harm it did. So if X number of people are murdered in Sri Lanka or something because something's been posted on Facebook, no responsibility. Whereas if the New York Times prints a false article and someone gets killed, you can go to a court of law. They're not even regulated in the way that the information is regulated that comes from a publisher, for instance, or a newspaper.
Sure. Or if we look at medicine and how strictly, there are medical trials and there are rules before new medicines can be put out on the market, and then there are tons of warnings and criteria.
Well, and if a doctor kills you in America, you can sue for malpractice.
Exactly, but I mean, to prevent all that from happening, there are enormous amounts of steps to keep the unlimited ambition or greed of the pharmaceutical companies at bay.
Yeah,
but
that's called government regulation.
Exactly, and that equivalent doesn't exist in a mature way for the tech sector yet.
Yeah, and the point you're making is so important. It is our governments that gave them this unlimited power. Said, hey, we're not going to count what happens online as pertaining to any of our legal structure.
Yeah, and more than that, because that's about intermediary liability. But when I heard the farewell address by President Biden, and he warned for the tech oligarchs,
yeah,
he was right, of course. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, like, how did we get here? And
yes.
why only use those words at the farewell address? So this is a boomerang that has come back to hit America, like many other boomerangs, like election interference through social media was very clear in other parts of the world before it sort of hit home in the United States. But only when it hit home in the United States did people start to raise their eyebrows.
Paying attention. But I have a question for you as someone who's been close to some of these people personally in Stanford and other places, because you yourself have been part of the tech industry and an insider, as it were. And so
I've actually not been part of the industry. I think it's important to make that clear. I have lived in Silicon Valley, but I've never worked for tech.
But you have spoken and studied on this for quite some time.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, so I didn't mean part of the industry. What I really was saying, I was finding a fancy way of saying, you know what you're talking about.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully I try.
Yeah. I mean, insider in the sense that you've been close to it in geographical locations, knowing people personally and all the rest.
Well, that's true.
Okay. So how do these guys regard the rest of us? In other words, what if you can get inside somebody, wealth and power changes everybody. I've been in the movie business. I knew people before they were movie stars and after they were movie stars. I know authors who, went on Oprah and became very famous and made a lot of money. Even little bits of success in something as peripheral as the movie business changes someone. Rock stars, same sort of phenomena. So it's not only who is Elon Musk born as or Jeff Bezos born as, it's what has being this done to them, in the same way that being the Prince of Wales in England and living that privileged life your whole life and then becoming a king, you're not the person you would have been if you had just been another guy. So I'm asking this question on two levels. How do they regard the rest of us, both as personalities, this kind of, these tech geniuses, but then in terms of who they've become? How do they regard us, the people whose rights are being stripped by them and who have no recourse at all within our system? How do they regard us?
Well, I think that in general, nobody act with the intention to do harm necessarily. So I think that they are convinced of their good intentions and that their good outcomes. And that kind of self-confidence must have been there from the beginning. Of course, a number of these people are incredibly smart and talented and have taken bold steps for which they've been rewarded by the market, rewarded by the scale. And so they must feel like they were right and, more right as they went along. And from Silicon Valley, if you have, the resources which these people have, the world looks like a field of opportunity, but it's also, California can have a bit of a sensation of being on an island because it is so removed from a whole bunch of other places in the world, even from, like the capital of the United States. And so I think it's very easy to get stuck in this excited, self-confident land of opportunity.
Move fast and break things.
Yeah, that, but also just really to be excited about opportunities and to entirely forget about downsides. And I think that's obviously unacceptable neglect, but I do understand how it happened because this is a sort of self-reinforcing world of success. I mean, people are also pitching all the time. I've heard people recently remarking how generative AI sounds so self-confident, how it can actually spit out entire lies, but just present it in a way that makes you believe it, even if it is like a wrong mention on your own CV. It just sounds so convincing. Yeah. And it's probably because the tone of voice reflects the culture in which these products are made. Self-confident. Sure. Pitching, I know what I'm doing. Give me money. This is an amazing product. The sky is the limit. We're going to solve climate change. We're going to solve cancer. We're going to, it's always looking at the world from the best possible scenario. Sure. And of course, governments have to look at the world from multiple scenarios, including the worst possible scenario. Yeah. And I think now the attention needs to go to all the harms we've already learned, the harms that may still be on the horizon, and the responsibility that companies have. And a number of those harms are far removed from the direct users of these products because they ripple through like a tsunami through our society, essentially.
Yeah. And of course, we see this on a small level with, just kids and the kind of fatal attraction of the phone and people feeling they're losing control over childhoods, all the way to the huge level of a loss of democratic structure and governance. So I'm going to bow out and just say that this has been a pleasure. Hold your book up again. Go buy this book and pay attention to it. And it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Marietje. Talk to Ernie for a minute. I'm going to go out, but you stay on.
Thank you for having me, and I'm sorry for the abrupt end.
You know what? You're busy. This is great. People need to know about you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.